this to happen, for banks to hide losses, to not prosecute bankers, but allow the people of this country to suffer in such a way?
Well,
I mean, I'm asking you a question that,
yeah.
I'm not expecting you to answer, because you're not like it's
Well,
like, for me, I'm like,
I can
how have we come to that?
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
I can partially answer it. If you were an American and you were on a bonus scheme, and let's assume that you decided to buy private jets and all sorts of things, so you were up to your neck in borrowed money, and therefore you were dependent on a bonus scheme. You would push for anything that improves your bonus. And in America, what they decided was that if banks were allowed to delay the recognition of losses, we could sell them complicated structured products to people, and they wouldn't have to recognize the loss. So we're selling dodgy stuff to people. They don't recognize the loss, therefore it's easy for us to sell them. I get my bonus. That's how it starts. So if you want to follow the money, look at how bonuses are calculated. As Charlie Munger said, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. And if you're paying people bonuses to enter into loss-making transactions, you can rest assured that banks will accumulate substantial losses. Now, they did that in Ireland between 2005 and 2008 or 2010. In 2010, when it was all discovered, the government were given a choice. The correct approach the government should have taken is to say to the banks, we know you've overvalued the assets. We want the auditors to go in, check the proper valuation of the assets, and see what your shortfall is. And then we'll bail you out, because we have to bail you out. We need you to keep functioning. But if they had done it properly, the auditors would have gone in and said, there's a discount of about 50% or 55% that we have to apply to these loans. Therefore, the Irish banks have been trading insolvent. They have been trading when the value of their assets is well below the value of their liabilities. They are in breach of company law, and it's a potential criminal offence. So a lot of Irish bankers and UK bankers would have found themselves in prison if the Irish government had done it properly. They didn't do it properly. What they said was, keep on declaring that you're solvent. Tell the world that there's just difficulty borrowing money because everyone's in panic mode. Then we'll put money into the bank, we'll bail you out, we'll get shareholders to put money in the bank as well. And then when you have enough capital in the bank, you can start declaring losses. So you can delay declaring them and declare them gradually so that you'll never appear to be insolvent. So you can see the motivation behind all of this.
100%. But it's the, if I was like, a conspiracy theorist or something, I'd be saying, well, it's the 5% win again at the and the rest of us suffer. So to stop a few bankers going to prison, we made, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people suffer. Like, that was created by those decisions.
Yeah, definitely.
People's miseries.
I mean, it was foreseeable.
People who were encouraged to buy these houses.
Yeah. They knew that they were going to suffer, and they knew that quite a lot of them were going to go bankrupt. And the evidence for that is that when AIB and Bank of Ireland were forced to sell their loan portfolios to NAMA, the National Asset Management Agency, a discount of up to 60% was applied, which means that the loans were grossly overvalued. So the foreseeable losses were about 60%. So in your example, if you borrowed 400,000, the NAMA would say, well, that loan is really only worth 240,000 if you take economic factors into consideration.
So having allowed the banks to sell a house for 400,000, then the government who set up NAMA are then saying, oh no, that house is only worth 200,000. They're saying it themselves, even though they've, on one hand, they've allowed it. Then they're going, no, that's not what that's worth.
Well, yeah, in the space of a few years, that's what happened. They would have issued a loan for 400,000 and then sold it for 240,000. And worse still, this accounting, if we can call it a fraud, I think it's quite safe to call it a fraud, opened the door to vulture funds, because vulture funds could go to the banks with the ECB's approval. The ECB would say to the banks, you have a number of dodgy loans on your books. We want you to be safer, so we want you to transfer all the dodgy loans to the vulture funds. And the vulture funds will say, yeah, we'll take on those loans, but we want a huge discount, because even though the loan might be worth 400,000 initially, it dropped down to 240,000. We have to make a profit. Therefore, we'll buy it off you for 160,000. And it's the vulture funds then that are pursuing the customer for the full 400,000 if they can get it. And because property prices have risen, they are going for the full 400,000. There was never any need for the vulture funds. They arose because of an accounting gimmickry. Banks could sell loans to vulture funds, but they didn't have to disclose the loss they made on the sale. They didn't have to disclose the discount. And therefore, technically, shareholders cannot approve the loan sale to vulture funds.
But what I can't understand is why, if you're a government minister, like, I mean, we all remember the O'Brien Cowan. We were all sort of glued to the TV and to the whatever, and he made this decision, late at night to bail out the banks, and this was a big thing, and it was almost like, my God, the politics became, the celebrity story. It was must watch TV. It was all people were talking about. He's bailed out the banks. I mean, I wonder what sort of conversations he was having, and why are we as Irish citizens, how did we end up in a place that we have a government who are more interested in keeping bankers out of prison than doing the right thing by the people that voted for them, and the people that essentially, employ them, and put them in those positions because we trust them? How have we as a country come to that position? Because that seems to have triggered something. You might say it started off with Charlie Hoy or whatever, but that certainly seemed to be the next development in the protection of the institution over the people, and we don't seem to have managed to be able to stop that since. If you go to the HSE, if you go to the care homes, if you go to HICWA regulators, they can't actually do anything. Central Bank now we're going to talk about as regulators, like that just doesn't seem, we don't seem to be, nobody in government seems to be able to shout stop,
Well, first of all, if you go back to the famous night of September 2008, when the bankers went into Leinster House, the bankers simply said to the government, if you force us to close banks, this is going to create a catastrophe. Your first priority is to keep banks open. And the only way you can do that is to lend us money or put money into the banks. And they got an accountancy firm to do a check on the assets, but the accountancy firm did not value the assets correctly. They were basically
the banks hired an accountancy firm.
The accountancy firms,
not the government.
There is evidence. I presume the government would have hired the accountancy firms, but the accountancy firms were in a conflict of interest because they were helping banks to hide losses. So it wasn't in their interest to expose all of this.
It wasn't truly independent.
They were not truly independent. So they basically gave a valuation which gave the impression that the banks were solvent and they just were short of cash. And the impression was that the government would get the cash back. But that didn't happen, of course.
So were the government when we bailed them out? Were the government unaware that there was?
They probably weren't aware on the night of 2008. They were unaware of what they were doing. There were famous Anglo tapes. I don't know if you recall them, where the chief executive of Anglo basically bullied the regulator. He said, if you want to see Anglo collapse, you're going to get into difficulty. And the regulator, through the central bank, would have put in funds into Anglo. And then Anglo would have said, well, you're going to be exposed for this particular mistake. I think the phrase they used was, you're pregnant on this issue. In other words, you're now committed to keeping Anglo open. Otherwise, you'll have to reveal that you made a huge mistake. So that's the way
you're an accessory to the crime.
You're a potential accessory to the crime. Yeah. But I suppose the important point of all this is it's all very well going through history and saying this is what happened.
Yeah. So where are we at
focus
now?
on the practicalities. A few groups of people have had successes. There was a group of tied agents. These were owners of building society franchises where they could basically set up shop and sell EBS mortgages. And they were in the newspaper recently because they had some success in saying to EBS, the reason we're in difficulty is because you can't supply mortgages to us. And the reason you can't supply mortgages to us is because you produced accounts which were misleading and therefore you couldn't borrow money. So it's your fault that we're in this difficulty. It's not bad luck or anything like that. It's your fault we're in this difficulty. And according to an article in the Mail on Sunday, these people were compensated. So there are groups of people who are pushing for to resolve this, and with some degree of success. Now, some of those tied agents were penalised for being vocal, or at least appear to be penalised for being vocal. But by and large, there are some success stories. Probably the most urgent issue at the moment are those people in court facing repossession. The vulture fund who's taken them to court has to prove two things. First of all, that they defaulted on their loans, and secondly, that the vulture fund is the proper authority or the proper party to enforce this particular loan. On the first point, how can a vulture fund prove that a customer has defaulted on their loan if the originating bank has not complied with unfair terms legislation? So, for instance, take your case: you bought a property for 400,000. The bank knew that there was a crisis on the horizon, and that the 400,000 was an unrealistic valuation, and that 250,000 was the better figure to use. Then you have not made an informed economic decision. So technically, you could say to the judge, how can the vulture fund claim that I'm defaulting when there is an unfair term in the loan contract? In other words, the clause is unenforceable purely because it's unfair. And even if you don't raise that, the judge, in theory, is obliged to look at the contract and see if there is an unfair term. He's obliged to ask himself, on the date this individual signed the contract, did he make an informed economic decision? And given what the bank knew and what you knew when you signed the contract, the judge would have to say, well, this mortgage contract is a lot more expensive than the 4% interest he's been quoted, because there are foreseeable losses here which the bank are going to impose on the customer that the customer is unaware of. So the judge should say that there are unfair, or could say that there are unfair terms in this loan contract. At least the matter should be investigated. In which case the party taking you to court is unable to prove that there is a default. The second thing that the vulture fund must prove is that they are the party entitled to take you to court or enforce the loan. And broadly speaking, they must have what's known as the legal title to do that. The legal title basically means that when you enter into a contract with the bank, then the bank have enforcement powers against you, and the bank claim they can transfer those enforcement powers to a vulture fund. But that is questionable, because this might get a bit technical, but it is important. When the bank would have taken out your loan or given you a loan in 2008, it was normal practice for the banks to securitize those loans. That means put them into a portfolio and sell that portfolio to foreign investors. That's known as securitization. So immediately after your loan was granted, they would have transferred your loan into a securitization vehicle. And it means that the bank is still the contracted party with you. It's known as the credit servicer. The bank becomes the credit servicer with you, so it still collects money from you. But any money it collects, subject to a small fee, is transferred to the purchasers of the securitization. In other words, the purchasers of the portfolio. Now, a practical problem arises because if the bank are not complying with company law, they are not allowed to transfer any money they collect from you to the securitization vehicle, for the simple reason that if the bank is not showing proper accounts, then all creditors must be protected. Not only the securitization purchasers, but all creditors must be protected. So therefore, they're not allowed to act as credit servicers while they're not producing accounts. The consequences of that is that if they cannot act as credit servicers, they lose the legal title to the loan, and therefore they cannot sue you in court. The securitization vehicle may be able to, but the bank cannot. But what has happened is the banks have failed to disclose that they're not showing their accounts properly. Therefore, they failed to inform the land registry that they've lost the legal title. But then they've sold the legal title to the vulture funds, so they have sold something they haven't got. And the courts should investigate this, because the banks should have informed the land registry that they no longer have the legal title. If they had, they would not have been able to sell the loan to the vulture fund. And Ed Honan, the Master of the High Court, has highlighted this point. He has highlighted the fact that the land registry records are wrong, and they can't use land registry records as evidence that they have the right to take you to court.
Mm.
So there's two valid points of defense there, which anyone facing repossession who borrowed money between about 2004, I'd say, to 2012, can make.
So anybody that's out there sweating about facing repossession, they have two valid arguments.
They have two valid arguments
to save their home, or to avoid prison, or what?
To save their homes and to avoid prison, because if customers or rather judges are giving orders based on we call it criminality, because if a bank fails to comply with company law and deliberately does so, that's a potential criminal offence. Then those orders would appear to be unsafe, and defendants should have an opportunity to defend themselves against that. This should be brought up in court so that the judge can determine whether a default has occurred, or whether the party, the vulture fund in the court, has the right to enforce the loan.
Okay, so it's good news. I mean, I think we're going to have to talk again sometime, because
But just before you say it's good news, I have to be careful and say it's qualified good news, because it's very hard to get this into courts. It's very hard to put those arguments into courts. This is because most possessions are on a summary basis, where everything is done by affidavit, and it means that if a person turns up in court, and the judge just reads the affidavit, and it's quite obvious that they just by affidavit alone, that the judge cannot see the nuances of the argument.
And won't allow the time.
And they take the view that the banks are represented by compliance teams and huge legal firms and expensive barristers. So if there was negligence or failure, that would have been stopped ages ago. There's no. If you're a compliance officer for a bank, in theory, there's no incentive for you to allow the banks to conceal losses or to mislead customers. But that's what's happening. So it's very hard to get that into summary cases. And what happens is, particularly in lay litigant cases, you have a lay litigant probably doesn't understand the nuances of what we've just discussed, and a barrister who knows how to get round all of this without revealing the truth. And therefore, there are repossession cases or flawed orders issued on that basis. And I have to say, it's very difficult to find a lawyer who will bring those two arguments up. They're either afraid to do so, or it involves a lot of research on their part, which they might not be paid for adequately. And it's a risk on their part, because even if they do bring up these arguments, the customer could still lose the case. So the way to do it, obviously, is through plenary hearing, where somebody can give expert evidence.
So once again, we're looking at justice in Ireland favouring the people with lost money. People
Well,
have
I
been
think with
poor.
summary cases, you can say that quite convincingly, because with summary cases, as I said, everything is done in affidavit, and the judge looks at this and says, okay, the guy borrowed money, he has to pay it back. He hasn't paid it back within the agreed time period. Then he looks at the land registry records and says, okay, Vulture Fund X is on the land registry records, therefore they're entitled to sue. So I have two simple decisions to make, and then I just move on. And some judges regard themselves as sympathetic by stating that customers should be put out of their misery. There's no point in this dragging on and getting them to court and getting them all tense and worked up. Just close it now and allow the customer to make plans.
Yeah, I mean, if you were a cynical type of person, you'd think this is like, almost like a decision that's been made to make sure that we keep a lid on the fact that the banks were always hiding losses, and therefore, once again, I'm not saying that's true, but if you were a cynical person, you looked at this, you go, once again, we're protecting the banks, we're stopping some bankers from going to prison, and that's all at the expense of the citizens of Ireland.
Yeah, I mean, it's again, the ordinary individual doesn't have lobbying power. Banks do, vulture funds do, so you're going to get a result that's rather there's a risk that you'll get a result which favors the banks or favors the powerful.
What are the central bank then? Why?
Well, the central bank are a very dangerous outfit because they're giving the impression that banks are regulated.
Yeah,
they're not regulated.
That's the problem. If there was no regulator, you'd be like, oh, right, everything's like, everything's just kind of whatever. Anything goes.
Just imagine one of these boiler companies from Nigeria rings you up and says, pay us 100,000 and we'll double it to 200,000. You might be foolish enough and say, okay, I'll give you 100,000. But the alternative is to go to a bank and borrow money. And you might say to your father, I haven't enough of the deposit here. Can you make up the difference? Now, your father wouldn't give you any money to invest in a Nigerian boilerplate scheme.
No.
But he'd give you the money to a bank because he assumes that the banks are regulated and properly supervised.
Yeah.
But that's not. The regulators are giving a false sense of assurance. The newspapers should also be covering this. But how many newspapers in the last 2 decades have said that banks are hiding huge amounts of losses in breach of company law? And you would have thought, okay, maybe 6 months they wouldn't have clocked onto this. So maybe back in 2005, you could forgive the newspapers for getting this wrong, but we're now 20 years on from 2005. We still have the problem. The newspapers are not covering it. Yet there are many columnists in newspapers are saying, that customers are suffering and we're looking after them and so forth. So it gives the impression that the newspapers are looking at banks and exposing wrongdoings, and the same with RTE. But in reality, none of the newspaper outlets or the media outlets in Ireland have said that banks are hiding losses in breach of company law. It just takes those 2 sentences. If that was said in the public media, I think judges would have to take a different view to how repossession cases are going. Because if banks are in breach of company law, it's impossible for them to comply with unfair terms legislation. If banks are hiding losses and they're trying to impose those losses on customers but not telling customers, then they are in breach of unfair terms legislation. And if banks are in breach of company law and selling loans to vulture funds without revealing the discount, then there is a risk that the vulture funds, A, are buying something that's worth nothing because the banks have already lost the legal interest. And secondly, when they're buying them at a discount and they're not approved by the shareholders, there is the risk that the sale is invalid.
So, I mean, I don't want to keep you too much longer, but can we then come to the conclusion that the reason there's a housing crisis at the moment, and young families, people who even public servants like a Garda and a nurse, don't have enough money to put their salaries together to buy a house. Can we say that all of this is coming from this, banking, the hiding losses, central bank not regulating?
Yeah, if I take you back before 2000, and I was a banker, and you were in Dublin paying extortionate rent, I would approach you because it's in my interest to approach you and say you can get a mortgage and reduce your monthly outgoings by 25%, and you become the owner of the house after a while. And you would find that attractive. But banks are not doing that today. And the reason they're not doing it is for two reasons. A, no one knows if they're hiding losses still. And B, because no one knows that, the central bank have taken the view that the best way to control the banking system is to control the number of mortgages they issue, or restrict the number of mortgages they issue. The less they issue, the less risk, and therefore they can stay afloat. If they are allowed to issue more mortgages, there is the risk that we go back to 2005 and have another banking crash. In reality, we need to take banks back to the 1980s and 2000, when under company law, they were forced to reveal all losses. So therefore, they would steer away from dodgy loans. They would have precautions in place to make sure that they wouldn't enter into dodgy loans. In other words, 110% mortgages or 150% mortgages. That's not happening today. And therefore, we have a dysfunctional banking system. And we have two groups of people. We have people who are in emergency accommodation and are dependent on the state. And then we have people who are middle income, who can afford a mortgage but are denied the mortgages. Both are forced into the rental sector. And it means that the social welfare people are paying extortionate rents or even hotel fees, when in reality, what they should be doing is going to the banks and setting up a trust where, instead of putting people into hotels, the hotel income is put into this trust and used to borrow money to build houses. That's known as social housing. That's what they did years ago. They don't do that anymore. And then for the people who are on professional incomes or are on decent incomes, to make sure that they have mortgage facilities available to them. But what's happening in the government is, or rather in Ireland, is that the people who own property want property to go up. And often they're in very rich areas, and often they can influence government policy. And of course, the vulture funds want a situation where everyone in Ireland rents and they own the properties. So there is a lot of pressure to keep the status quo, and
nobody with the balls to stop.
The power to stop. That's the problem.
So all of this has happened because we wanted to keep a few people who worked in the banking sector out of prison.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I don't think we'd have got to the stage where we're at the moment
if we just
back in 2008, somebody said to the banks, "If you want money from us, tell us your true position. Tell us the truth at that point. If you have to go to prison, you have to go to prison, but tell us the truth, and then we decide how much money you need."
And then with the central bank, we have a regulator who's not actually regulating. But it's worse. It's worse.
It's worse because
it's worse because it looks like
that it's regulating. So it means that the Irish banks have a competitive advantage over their Nigerian counterparts.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I know there's a case on at the moment. We don't really want to talk about it, but maybe come back and talk to us about that. And if anybody has any questions, I can put those to you then when we talk again, maybe in a week or two.
Sure,
so if anybody watching has any questions, you can send them to us on X or Instagram or Moth News. And maybe I'll put some of those questions to you if anybody who's finding themselves in trouble, or I'm shocked. The more I talk to people like yourself,
the worse.
My jaw can't drop anymore. So look, I appreciate your time. It's probably a bit longer than we both anticipated, but let's do this again and maybe again and again and again, because I have a lot of questions for you.
Okay.
Cormac, thank you very much, and best of luck with everything, and we'll chat again soon.
Sure. Okay. Thank you very much.
All right. Have a good day. All right. Thank you very much.
Bye.
So there you have it. That is Cormac Butler, and I'm very shocked. Yeah, very shocked. I don't even know what to say. Look, we are going to be on live at 11 o'clock. I got to leg it, get into the studio. Thank you very much to Cormac Butler. We will definitely be talking to him again. There's a lot to unpack there. I did spend a lot of time going back to the history of how we got to this point, but I just needed to, and we will talk to him again. I think we should do a series of conversations with Cormac, and we should talk about it until central bank start regulating. And the property crisis, homelessness. So a few bankers, to keep a few bankers out of prison. Is that what we want for Ireland? Is that what we want? Is that the country we want to be living in? Anyway, I'll talk to you. We'll be live at 11 o'clock, and I'll have clips of this. And please do feel free to share this with anybody that you think might be in trouble, might be looking at losing their homes, might be in danger of, might be looking at facing prison, whatever. Show them this. Tell them about Cormac. Look for articles. There are arguments to be made. I got to go. Chat to you from Moth News Live at 11 o'clock. I've got about 45 minutes to get there and get myself set up. It's exciting. I'm like Annika Rice. I'll see you then.